In the brutal, unforgiving theater of war, a single soldier is a tiny cog in a vast impersonal machine. His survival depends on his unit, on supply lines, on command. But what happens when that machine breaks down? When the lines are severed, and command believes you are lost? What happens when one man is abandoned in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded on all sides? This is not a story of a vast army, but of a single individual. A story of desperation, of ingenuity, and of a will to survive so fierce it would become the stuff of legend. This is the story of a soldier left behind. And this is how he fought for 3 days. Completely alone. The date is June 27, 1944. The location, the shattered villages and dense woodlands near Vitebsk in Belarusia. The German Wehrmacht is in a desperate, bloody retreat, and the Soviet Red Army is advancing with overwhelming force. In this chaos, one man, a simple infantryman, would be separated from his company. For 72 hours, he would wage his own private war. To understand the sheer scale of this one man's ordeal, we must first understand the maelstrom into which he was thrown. By late June 1944, the Soviet Union's Operation Bagration was underway, a colossal offensive designed to annihilate the German Army Group Center. It was a storm of steel and fire on a scale the world had scarcely seen. Our story centers on a single unit within this cataclysm, the 14th Company of the 131st Infantry Division. Among its ranks was Gefreiter, or Lance Corporal, Garleff. His full identity remains somewhat obscured by time, a common fate for many soldiers on the Eastern Front. But the skeleton of his incredible story was documented in after-action reports and witness testimonies. Karl was not a Special Forces operative. He was not a seasoned commando trained for behind-the-lines operations. He was a Lanzer, a German infantryman, a cog. His world was his rifle, his comrades, and the orders from above. His equipment was standard issue, a Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifle, a few stick grenades, and whatever rations he could carry. He was in every sense an ordinary soldier. The strategic situation was dire. The 131st Division was part of a crumbling defensive line. Soviet spearheads consisting of T-34 tanks and hardened infantry were slicing through German positions, creating pockets of isolated troops. The order came down: a tactical withdrawal to a new defensive line several miles to the west. It was a maneuver of extreme danger, conducted under constant artillery barrage and the threat of Soviet ambush. For the men of the 14th Company, the withdrawal began under the cover of a damp gray dawn. They moved in single file, through thick pine forests and across muddy fields, the sound of battle never far away. It was in this tense, exhausting retreat, amidst the confusion and the ever-present fear, that disaster struck for one man. The company was moving through a particularly dense stretch of woodland when the lead elements ran headlong into a Soviet reconnaissance patrol. The silence was shattered by the staccato rip of PPSH-41 submachine guns and the answering cracks of German Mausers. In the initial chaotic exchange of fire, the company became fragmented. Karl, positioned near the rear of the column, dove for cover behind a fallen pine tree. For 10 minutes the firefight raged. He could hear the shouts of his sergeant, the screams of the wounded, the crashing of men through the undergrowth. Then, as suddenly as it began, the firing slackened. A whistle blew, the signal to disengage and continue the retreat. Karl, along with a handful of others, provided covering fire as the main body of the company pulled back. What happened next was a simple, tragic miscommunication in the fog of war. Believing all his men were clear, the sergeant gave the final order for the rear guard to fall back. Karl, focused on reloading his rifle and watching the tree line for enemy movement, did not hear the order over the ringing in his ears. By the time he looked up, the forest around him was silent, save for the moans of the fallen and the distant, fading sounds of his comrades. He was alone. For the first hour, a cold dread settled in his gut. He was a 22-year-old man, suddenly severed from the only lifeline he had. The forest, once just terrain, now felt like a prison. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. He knew the Soviets would be swarming through this area soon, mopping up stragglers. His first instinct was to run west to try and catch up. But which way was west? The sun was obscured by thick cloud and the forest canopy was dense. It was then he heard them, the guttural sounds of Russian voices growing closer. A squad of Soviet soldiers, perhaps 8 or 9 strong, was moving through the area, checking the German dead. Karl pressed himself into the hollow beneath his fallen tree. his heart hammering against his ribs. He could see their boots just feet away. This was the first test. To be found meant capture or a swift death. He held his breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his 90K. One of the soldiers paused, lighting a cigarette, his back to Carl's hiding spot. For a full minute he stood there, before moving on with his comrades. Carl knew he could not move by day. The area was too active. He spent the remainder of that first day hidden, his mind racing. He had a full canteen, half a loaf of hardtack bread, and 2 magazines of ammunition for his rifle. It was nowhere near enough. As dusk began to settle, casting long, sinister shadows through the pines, he formulated a plan. He would move only at night, navigating by the stars when possible. His objective was not just to survive, but to fight. He was a soldier after all, and he would wage his war. His war began that first night. Creeping through the undergrowth, he discovered a small, disused hunter's trail. Moving with painstaking slowness, he covered perhaps 2 miles before the sound of voices and the glow of a campfire halted him. Peering through the foliage, he saw a small Soviet forward observation post. 2 soldiers were stationed by a radio. A third was cooking over a fire. They were complacent, believing themselves deep in secured territory. Carl was faced with an impossible choice: slip away into the night or strike a blow. The anger, the frustration, the sheer terror of the last 18 hours coalesced into a cold, focused resolve. He was not just a lost soldier. He was a predator in the dark. By the morning of the second day, Carl had found a new hiding place, a dense, almost impenetrable thicket of brambles and young spruce trees, overlooking a shallow stream. He had not slept. The adrenaline from the previous night's encounter still coursed through him. He had taken a huge risk, and it had paid off. But now, in the cold light of day, the reality of his situation was crushing. He was deep behind enemy lines. Every building, every road, every footpath was now controlled by the enemy. He was utterly isolated with no hope of rescue. The sheer psychological weight of this knowledge would have broken most men. The temptation to simply lie down, to give up, must have been immense. But Carl's will held. He spent the day observing. He saw Soviet supply carts moving along a nearby dirt track. He saw infantry patrols, their numbers far greater than anything his division could have fielded. He was a single insignificant speck in the vast Soviet war machine. His ammunition was dwindling. His food was nearly gone. The water in his canteen was warm and stale. This was the crisis. Not a single, dramatic battle, but a slow, grinding realization of his own utter insignificance and the near certainty of his fate. The true test came on the afternoon of the second day. A 4-man Soviet patrol, seemingly on a routine sweep, decided to take a break by the stream, not 50 yards from his hiding place. They lounged on the bank, smoking and talking. Carl watched them, every muscle in his body tense. If one of them decided to venture into the thicket to relieve himself, he would be discovered. There would be no escape. For 40 agonizing minutes, he listened to their laughter, the sounds of a normal life in the midst of this hell. He was close enough to see the individual features of their faces. One was just a boy, no older than himself. The others were older, hardened veterans. He calculated his chances if he had to fight. 4 against 1. It was a suicide mission. He gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. The fear was a physical thing, a cold stone in his stomach. This was the moment everything could end. Then a whistle blew in the distance. The patrol sergeant barked an order, and the 4 men shouldered their weapons and trudged off, leaving behind the crushed grass and the lingering smell of tobacco. The relief was temporary. As night fell on the second day, a new problem emerged: the cold. Without a fire and with only his standard-issue uniform, the chill seeped into his bones. Hunger gnawed at his insides. He was beginning to weaken. His thoughts grew sluggish. He knew he couldn't last another day like this. He had to be more aggressive. He had to find supplies. His target was a small, isolated farmhouse he had spotted during his nighttime movements. A light had been visible in the window, suggesting it was occupied, likely by Soviet troops using it as a billet. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was now his only commanding officer. Under the cover of a moonless night, Carl approached the farmhouse. He moved like a ghost, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid snapping a single twig. From the edge of the tree line, he observed the structure for over an hour. He saw 2 sentries, one at the front door, one at the rear. They were bored, their attention wandering. Light and the sound of raucous singing spilled from the windows. It was clear a larger group was inside, likely resting. His objective was not to attack the main force, but to find the supplies he so desperately needed. His attention fixed on a small, separate log structure, a storage shed. It was dark and crucially unguarded. The sentry at the rear of the main house was his problem. The man made a circuit every 15 minutes, disappearing around the far corner for a few minutes at a time. This was the turning point. Not a grand heroic charge, but a silent, calculated act of theft and survival. Carl waited for the sentry to complete his round and vanish around the corner. Then, in a low crouch, he sprinted across the open ground, his heart in his throat. He reached the shed and tried the door. It was locked. Panic threatened to rise. He had seconds. He could try to force it, but the noise would alert the sentry. Then, his hand brushed against a loose board on the side of the shed. With a firm, steady pressure, he pried it back just enough to squeeze through the gap. Inside it was pitch black. His hands fumbled over crates and sacks. He felt the distinctive shape of a loaf of bread. Then his fingers closed around the cold, cylindrical shape of a tin. More tins, food. Then his most critical find, a wooden crate filled with Soviet F1 grenades and a box of 7.62 54mm cartridges. They were useless for his German rifle, but he took several grenades. As he was about to leave, his foot kicked against something else, a Soviet PPSH-41 submachine gun, leaning against the wall as if forgotten. It was a gift from the gods of war. With its high rate of fire and 71-round drum magazine, it was the perfect weapon for the kind of close-quarters chaos he was now a part of. He stuffed the bread and tins into his pack, slung the PPS over his shoulder, and clutched 2 grenades in his hands. He peered through the gap in the board. The coast was clear. He slipped out and melted back into the forest, his mission a success. He was no longer just a fugitive with a bolt-action rifle. He was now a properly armed insurgent in his own private war. The discovery of the Soviet weapon was the key that unlocked a new, more aggressive strategy. He would no longer just hide. He would harass. He would make the enemy believe a significant partisan force was operating in the area. On the 3rd day, he used his new arsenal. He laid a simple ambush on the dirt track, tying a grenade to a tree as a crude tripwire device. Later that afternoon, he heard the satisfying explosion, followed by shouts of confusion and panic. He didn't stay to see the results. He had struck his blow and vanished back into the wilderness. By the morning of the 4th day, the relentless pressure of the Soviet advance had finally pushed the front. Lines past Karl's position. A forward patrol from a different German unit, advancing cautiously into the area, stumbled upon a haggard, wild-eyed figure in a tattered German uniform, armed with a mix of German and Soviet weaponry. At first, they almost shot him, mistaking him for a partisan. But his hoarse, desperate cries of "Kamerad" saved his life. He was brought back to the German lines, a living ghost. He was suffering from severe exhaustion, dehydration, and exposure. But he was alive. The story he told his debriefing officers was so incredible it was initially met with skepticism. However, subsequent patrols into the area confirmed his account. The destroyed observation post, the ambushed supply cart, the general confusion he had sowed behind Soviet lines. While he was not awarded the Knight's Cross, his actions were recognized with the German Cross in Gold, a high-level award for repeated acts of extraordinary bravery. The official citation noted his independent action, iron will, and exceptional bravery while separated from his unit from June 27th to June 30th, 1944, during which he inflicted significant losses and disruption on the enemy. The legacy of Gefreiter Karl F. is not one of a decisive battle that changed the course of the war. It is a more intimate human legacy. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit when faced with absolute hopelessness. His story became a minor legend among the Landser of the Eastern Front, a tale whispered in dugouts to give men hope that even when all seems lost, one man with enough courage and cunning can endure. He survived the war, returning to a quiet life, his name fading from public memory. But his three-day war stands as a powerful reminder. In the vast, anonymous slaughter of the Eastern Front, heroism was not always found in grand offensives. Sometimes it was found in the heart of a single, forgotten soldier, determined to see one more sunrise. The solitary stand of one man against an army. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.